You know what's strange? We always talk about how the Black Death killed millions. But we rarely ask the more interesting question, how did anyone survive it at all? Think about it. No antibiotics. No hospitals. No understanding of germs. Just people facing an invisible enemy that was killing a third of Europe. And yet, humanity didn't end. So tonight, let's explore something fascinating. Not how medieval people defeated the plague, because they didn't, but how they survived it anyway. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. It's 1348. You live in a crowded medieval city. The streets smell of waste. Rats run freely between wooden houses. And then one day, your neighbor starts coughing. 3 days later, they're dead. A week later, half your street is gone. What would you do? Where would you even begin? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you might think. Medieval people survived the Black Death the same way water finds cracks in stone. Not through force, but through 1,000 small movements, most of them unconscious, happening over years and generations. Let me take you back to the beginning. The year is 1347. A fleet of trading ships docks in Sicily, arriving from the Black Sea. The sailors are sick. Some are already dead. The crew tells stories of a mysterious illness that swept through their port in Crimea, killing thousands in days. Within hours of docking, the disease begins its work. Within days, it spreads through the port city like wildfire. Within months, it's racing across Europe faster than any army could march. And here's what makes it terrifying. Nobody knows what it is. Medieval doctors had theories, of course. They called it the pestilence, the great mortality, the blue sickness. They thought it came from bad air, from miasma rising from swamps and corpses. They believed it was caused by an unfortunate alignment of planets in 1345, when Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars came together in a way that poisoned the atmosphere. Some thought it was God's wrath, punishment for humanity's sins. Others blamed earthquakes releasing toxic fumes from deep within the earth. A few even suggested it was poison spread by outsiders, by lepers, by Jews, by anyone who seemed different or suspicious. They were wrong about almost everything. But they were right about one thing: it was spreading from person to person, from place to place. And that observation, even without understanding why, would save countless lives. Picture a merchant in Florence. His name might have been Antonio or Giovanni, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is what he saw. He owned a successful cloth shop near the Ponte Vecchio. Every day, dozens of customers came through his door. Rich nobles, guild workers, servants buying for their masters. And then, in the spring of 1348, they started dying. First it was whispers. Someone's cousin in Genoa had fallen ill. Then someone's brother in Pisa. Then it was closer. A customer who had been healthy yesterday was dead today. Another stopped coming to the shop. Then another. He watches his apprentice, a boy of 15, develop a fever. By evening, black swellings appear under the boy's arms. By morning, he's gone. This merchant doesn't know about bacteria or fleas or rats. But he notices something. The busiest parts of the city are hit hardest. The crowded markets where bodies press together. The packed churches where people gather to pray for deliverance. The busy taverns where merchants make deals over wine. Wherever people gather, death follows. So what does he do? He makes a choice. He closes his shop. He takes his wife, his 2 surviving children, and whatever gold he can carry. He abandons the city that's been his home for 3 generations. He heads into the countryside, to a small villa his family owns, a place he's visited maybe twice in his life. He doesn't know if this will help. He just knows he has to get away from the dying. This happened thousands of times across Europe. In Paris, in London, in Venice, in Barcelona. People fled. Not because they understood epidemiology, but because instinct told them to run from death. Cities that were once bursting with 100,000 people suddenly had only 30,000. Streets that once rang with voices fell silent. Markets that once overflowed with goods stood empty. And in that silence, in that accidental isolation, the plague began to lose its grip. But it wasn't just about running away. Some people couldn't leave. Farmers had crops to tend. If they abandoned their fields, everyone would starve. Bakers had bread to make. Without bakers, cities would collapse within days. Priests had duties to perform. Someone had to bury the dead, and the dead were piling up faster than anyone could count. So they adapted in other ways. They started avoiding strangers. They stopped gathering in large groups. They began keeping their distance from the sick, even from their own families. I want you to understand how brutal this was. Imagine watching your own child burning with fever, their skin covered in dark swellings that leak pus and blood, and being told by everyone around you to stay away. To let them die alone. Some people did it. They stood outside their children's rooms and listened to them call for water, for comfort, for anything, and they didn't go in. Some people couldn't. They went in anyway, held their dying children, and usually died themselves within days. There is a story from Siena, recorded by a chronicler named Agnolo di Giura. He wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. I, Agnolo di Giura, buried my 5 children with my own hands." 5 children with his own hands. Because there was nobody else left to do it. That's the level of devastation we're talking about. And yet, Agnolo survived. He lived through the plague and wrote about it, which means he made choices, conscious or not, that kept him alive. There's a village in England called Iam. Now, this happened much later, in 1665, centuries after the first wave of plague. But the story matters because it shows what medieval people learned over those centuries. A tailor in the village received a package of cloth from London. The cloth was infested with plague fleas. Within days, people started dying. The villagers could have run. They could have scattered to neighboring towns and saved themselves. But they'd heard stories. They knew what happened when plague spread to new places. So they made an extraordinary decision. They quarantined themselves. Nobody in, nobody out. They drew a circle around their village and chose to die rather than spread the disease to others. The local rector, William Mumpson, organized the quarantine. Neighboring villages left food and supplies at boundary stones around Iam. The villagers would come, take what they needed, and leave coins in vinegar as payment. They thought the vinegar would cleanse the money of disease. It probably didn't, but the physical separation worked. 350 people lived in Iam when the plague arrived. By the time it ended 14 months later, 260 were dead. Entire families wiped out. But the surrounding villages untouched. The people of Iam didn't know they were practicing epidemiological containment. They just knew it was the right thing to do, and they were willing to sacrifice everything for it. But isolation alone couldn't explain survival. Because remember, this wasn't a single outbreak. The Black Death came in waves. It struck in 1347 and killed millions. Then it came back in 1361, killing more. Then 1374. Then 1390. Then 1400. Then 1420. On and on, every decade or so, for 300 years. Each time it came back, it killed thousands, sometimes millions. So there had to be something else. Something that changed not just in how people behaved, but in who they were. Let me tell you about the immune system. Your body is a fortress, constantly under siege from invisible invaders. Right now, as you listen to this, your immune system is fighting off dozens of potential infections. Bacteria on your skin trying to get into cuts. Viruses in the air you breathe. Fungi on surfaces you touch. Most of the time, you don't even notice the battles happening inside you. Your white blood cells identify threats, remember them, and destroy them. This is immunity. And it can be passed down through generations. When the Black Death first struck, most people had no immunity to it. Their bodies had never seen anything like it. The disease was new, aggressive, and their immune systems were overwhelmed. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, attacks the lymphatic system. Those black swellings, the buboes that gave bubonic plague its name, were lymph nodes desperately trying to fight the infection. In most people, they failed. The bacteria multiplied too fast. Within 3 to 5 days, the infected person was dead. But some people, for reasons we still don't fully understand, were able to fight it off. Maybe they had a genetic variation that made their immune cells more effective. Maybe they had been exposed to similar diseases before that primed their immune system. Maybe they got a lower initial dose of bacteria. Maybe they were just lucky. Whatever the reason, they survived. And here's where it gets interesting. Those survivors had children. And many of those children inherited their parents' resistance. Not complete immunity, but enough to give them a fighting chance. Over generations, the population slowly began to shift. The people most vulnerable to the plague died before they could have children. The people most resistant lived and reproduced. This wasn't a conscious choice. It was simply natural selection, happening in real time across an entire continent. There's a gene mutation called CCR5 delta 32. Scientists have found it in high frequencies among people of European descent, particularly in Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe. This mutation affects a protein on the surface of white blood cells. Under normal circumstances, this protein helps immune cells do their job. But the mutation changes it in a way that makes cells more resistant to certain infections. Researchers believe this mutation became common because it provided protection during the Black Death. The plague didn't just kill millions. It rewrote human DNA. If you're of European descent, there's a significant chance you carry this mutation. It's in your cells right now, a molecular scar from a pandemic your ancestors survived 700 years ago. But genetics and isolation still don't tell the whole story. Because medieval people also changed their environment, even if they didn't realize why they were doing it. Let's talk about cities. Medieval cities before the plague were death traps. Imagine London in 1340. 60,000 people crammed into an area of about 1 square mile. Houses built right on top of each other, sometimes sharing walls, often sharing roofs. second and third stories jutting out so far over the streets that you could reach across and shake your neighbor's hand. Streets so narrow that two people could barely walk side by side. There was no sewage system. People threw their waste into the streets or into open pits behind their houses. Butchers slaughtered animals and left the offal to rot in piles. Tanners soaked hides in urine and disposed of the hair and fat in alleys. Fresh water came from wells and rivers, the same rivers where waste was dumped. The Thames was as much a sewer as a water source. Rats nested in the walls, in the thatched roofs, in the piles of garbage. Fleas thrived in the filth, in the straw on floors, in the unwashed clothes people wore for months. Dogs and pigs roamed freely, eating garbage and spreading more filth. The smell must have been overwhelming, though people who lived there probably didn't notice anymore. Then the plague came and killed so many people that entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Buildings collapsed. Streets emptied. Bodies lay where they fell because there weren't enough living people to bury them. At one point, London's population dropped from 60,000 to about 30,000 in just 2 years. Half the city dead or gone. And in that devastation, something unexpected happened. The cities became cleaner. Not because anyone planned it, but because there were simply fewer people creating waste. The rat populations declined because there was less garbage to eat. The flea populations declined because there were fewer rats and fewer humans. The disease had fewer hosts, fewer vectors, fewer ways to spread. After the plague, when survivors began rebuilding, they did things differently. Not radically different, mind you. They didn't suddenly invent modern sanitation or understand germ theory. But they made small changes. They built houses with more space between them. They started moving waste outside the city walls instead of dumping it in the streets. They began to value fresh water and tried to keep it separate from sewage. They built back houses and encouraged people to wash. There's an interesting irony here. Before the plague, bath houses were common in medieval Europe. People bathed regularly, sometimes several times a week. Then the plague arrived, and doctors started warning people that bathing opened the pores and let bad air into the body. Bath houses closed. People stopped bathing. And hygiene actually got worse for a while. But eventually, common sense prevailed. People noticed that cleaner cities seemed healthier. They didn't understand about bacteria or infection, but they could see that removing filth reduced disease. And over time, those observations became habits, then customs, then laws. By the 16th century, many European cities had regulations about waste disposal, about keeping streets clean, about isolating the sick. These weren't scientifically informed policies. They were lessons learned through centuries of death. Let me pause here and ask you something. Do you think medieval people were stupid? A lot of modern people do. We look back at their beliefs, their superstitions, their complete misunderstanding of disease, and we feel superior. We laugh at the idea of bad air causing plague. We scoff at the doctors who wore birdbeak masks filled with herbs, thinking the smell would protect them. We shake our heads at the people who prayed and flagellated themselves instead of washing their hands. But consider this, they survived. They endured the worst pandemic in human history with none of the tools we take for granted, and they found ways to adapt, to protect themselves, to keep humanity going. They made observations without microscopes. They formed theories without laboratories. They developed public health measures without understanding public health. That doesn't sound stupid to me. That sounds remarkably clever. Now, I need to tell you about something uncomfortable. Something we don't like to think about. Fear and faith. When the plague arrived, People turned to religion. Of course they did. What else did they have? They prayed. They begged God for mercy. They organized mass processions where thousands of people marched through the streets, singing hymns, asking for forgiveness. The church told them the plague was divine punishment for sin. People believed it? What else could explain such horror? In the city of Tournai in Belgium, a chronicler recorded that people began to live more virtuously, abstaining from taverns, games, swearing, and whoring. Fear of death made people examine their souls. Some people gave away their possessions to the poor, hoping to earn salvation. Others locked themselves in monasteries, dedicating their lives to prayer. Still others gave up entirely, deciding that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well enjoy their last days. The chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio wrote about people who spent day and night going from tavern to tavern, drinking and carousing unrestrainedly. Groups of flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. They would arrive in a city, march to the main square, remove their shirts, and beat themselves with leather whips embedded with metal studs. Blood would stream down their backs. They would sing hymns and cry out for God's mercy. And crowds would gather to watch, believing that this display of suffering might convince God to lift the plague. None of this stopped the plague. In fact, those mass processions probably made it worse by bringing infected people together in tight crowds. The flagellants carried the disease with them from city to city. The packed churches became breeding grounds for infection. Prayer didn't cure anyone. Penance didn't save anyone. From a purely medical standpoint, all of this religious activity was useless or actively harmful. But here's the thing, faith served another purpose. It gave people a framework for understanding something incomprehensible. Imagine trying to make sense of a disease that killed seemingly at random. Healthy people dropped dead. Sick people sometimes recovered. Children died while old people survived. There was no pattern, no logic. How do you live with that kind of chaos? Religion provided an answer. It's God's will. It's punishment for sin. It's a test of faith. These answers might not have been scientifically accurate, but they made psychological sense. They gave people a sense of control, even if it was illusory. And most importantly, they gave people a reason to keep living. Psychological resilience matters in a pandemic. If people give up, if they stop taking care of themselves, if they lose all hope, they die faster. Depression weakens the immune system. Stress makes infections worse. Despair leads to dangerous behavior. Faith, whether in God or fate or anything else, can be the difference between fighting to survive and simply accepting death. Medieval people had faith in abundance. And while it didn't cure the disease, it helped them endure it. There's another aspect to this. Religion also provided social structure. When civil authorities collapsed, when governments stopped functioning, when families disintegrated, the church remained. Monasteries became centers of care for the sick. Monks and nuns stayed behind to tend to the dying when everyone else fled. Priests administered last rites to thousands of plague victims, often dying themselves in the process. There's a record from Avignon, where the Pope resided at the time. In the first few months of the plague, half the city's priests died. They died because they kept visiting the sick, kept performing their duties, kept doing the work nobody else would do. Were they foolish to risk their lives? Maybe. But their sacrifice also meant that social order didn't completely collapse. Babies were still baptized. Marriages were still performed. The dead were still blessed. These rituals might seem meaningless, but they gave people a sense of continuity, a feeling that civilization would continue. But faith alone couldn't sustain a population through centuries of recurring plague. Something else had to change. And eventually, it did. The plague itself began to evolve. Diseases, you see, don't want to kill their hosts. That sounds strange, but think about it from the pathogen's perspective. You're a bacteria or a virus. Your only goal is to reproduce and spread. If you kill everyone you infect too quickly, you run out of hosts. You burn yourself out. The most successful diseases are the ones that spread efficiently without killing everyone. They make people sick enough to cough and spread, but not so sick that they die immediately. There's evidence this happened with the plague. The later waves, while still devastating, weren't quite as catastrophic as the first. Mortality rates slowly declined over the centuries. The plague of 1347 killed about 30 to 60% of Europe's population. The plague of 1420 killed maybe 10 to 20%. Still horrific, but not apocalyptic. Part of this was human adaptation, our growing immunity, our improved behaviors. But part of it was also the disease itself changing, becoming slightly less virulent. This happens through random mutation. Every time bacteria reproduce, there's a chance of genetic copying errors. Most mutations are neutral or harmful to the bacteria, but occasionally, one makes the bacteria slightly more successful. If a mutation makes the bacteria spread more efficiently without killing the host as quickly, that strain will outcompete the more deadly strains. Over hundreds of years, over millions of infections, this evolutionary pressure can change a disease significantly. And then there's the other factor nobody could control, the weather. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, thrives in warm, dry conditions. It lives in the stomachs of fleas, which live on rats. Fleas are more active in summer. They bite more frequently. They spread disease more efficiently. Rats breed faster in temperate climates and when food is plentiful. So the plague followed a seasonal pattern. It would rage during the warm months and die down in winter. Year after year, this cycle repeated. But then something larger shifted. Europe entered what historians call the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that lasted from about 1300 to 1850. Winters grew longer and harsher. The Thames froze solid. The Baltic Sea iced over so completely that armies could march across it. Summers became cooler and wetter. Growing seasons shortened. These climate changes had devastating effects on agriculture. Crops failed. Famine swept across Europe, killing millions. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed about 10% of Europe's population from starvation and disease. Ironically, this famine may have slightly reduced the impact of the Black Death when it arrived 25 years later, simply because there were fewer people living in close quarters. But the cooling also affected the plague directly. Fleas couldn't survive as well in the cold. Rat populations declined when food became scarce. The disease found it harder to spread in cooler, wetter conditions. Climate, that vast and indifferent force, tipped the scales just enough to give humanity breathing room. Let me bring all of this together now. How did medieval people survive the Black Death? They survived through a combination of conscious and unconscious adaptations, through behavioral changes they didn't understand, through genetic selection they couldn't see, through environmental shifts they didn't cause, and through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. They survived by fleeing cities, even though they didn't know why it helped. They survived by isolating the sick, even though it broke their hearts. They survived by slowly, gradually cleaning their environment, even though they couldn't explain the connection to disease. They survived by passing down genetic resistances through generations, even though they had no concept of heredity. They survived by maintaining social bonds through faith and community, even when those same gatherings sometimes spread the disease. They survived through climate changes beyond their control. And they survived by simply outlasting the plague, year after year, generation after generation, until it finally faded away. The last major outbreak of plague in Western Europe was in 1720 in Marseille. A merchant ship called the Grand Saint Antoine arrived from the Middle East. Despite a strict quarantine system, the disease escaped. It killed about 100,000 people in Marseille and the surrounding region. But it didn't spread beyond province. The cities of Europe had learned their lessons. They locked down trade. They enforced quarantines. They isolated the sick. They buried the dead quickly and carefully. And the plague burned itself out. By then, over 350 years had passed since the Black Death first arrived. 3.5 centuries of recurring outbreaks, of death, of adaptation, of survival. The plague didn't end because humanity defeated it. It ended because humanity changed just enough, and the disease changed just enough, and the environment changed just enough, that the balance finally shifted. Today, we still have plague. It never went away. There are cases every year in various parts of the world. In the United States, there are about 7 cases annually, mostly in rural areas of the Southwest where prairie dogs carry infected fleas. In Madagascar, there still causes small outbreaks. In parts of Africa and Asia, it persists in wild rodent populations. But we have antibiotics now. We understand how it spreads. We can treat it. The mortality rate for treated plague is about 10%. For untreated plague, it's still around 60 to 90%, just like in medieval times. The disease hasn't become less dangerous. We've just become better at fighting it. But here's what I want you to take away from all this. Medieval people didn't have science, but they had observation. They didn't have medicine, but they had care. They didn't have understanding, but they had resilience. And that was enough. Barely, just barely, but enough. When we look back at history, we tend to search for heroes, for decisive moments, for battles won. We want a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. We want to believe that humans conquered the plague through courage and cleverness. But that's not what happened. The real story is messy, slower, less dramatic. Sometimes, survival isn't glorious. Sometimes it's just continuing. Getting up each day even when you don't want to. Making small choices that seem insignificant but add up over time. Adapting without even realizing you're adapting. Learning without knowing what you're learning. Enduring. The medieval people who survived the Black Death didn't win a victory. They simply persisted. And in the long arc of history, persistence is its own kind of triumph. Think about that the next time you face something that seems impossible. Something you don't understand, can't control, can't defeat through force of will alone. Sometimes the way through isn't to conquer. Sometimes it's just to endure. To make small, sensible choices. To trust your instincts even when you can't explain them. To maintain your humanity even when the world seems to be ending. To keep going, one day at a time, until the darkness finally passes. The Black Death killed tens of millions. Conservative estimates say 50 million died. Some historians think it was closer to 100 million. In some regions, 9 out of every 10 people died. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Bloodlines that had existed for generations ended in a single season. Languages died out. Traditions were lost. Knowledge vanished. But billions of us are here today, descended from the ones who survived. We exist because our ancestors refused to give up. They didn't need to understand the science. They didn't need to defeat the plague in single combat. They just needed to hold on. And they did. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember this: you come from survivors. Your ancestors lived through plagues, famines, wars, and disasters we can barely imagine. They made it through the darkest times in human history. And they passed their strength down to you, written into your very DNA, in genes that help you fight infections you'll never even know you had. You're tougher than you think. More resilient than you know. Because survival, real survival, isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up, again and again, even when you don't know if you can. Medieval people survived the Black Death not because they were stronger or smarter or more deserving than those who died. They survived because they kept trying. They kept adapting. They kept living. And eventually, after centuries of suffering, the world changed just enough for life to continue. That's not a dramatic ending. It's not a heroic victory. But it's real. And sometimes, reality is more powerful than any story we could invent. The Black Death didn't end with a bang. It faded away, slowly, quietly, over generations. And one day, people realized they hadn't heard of a new outbreak in years. Then decades. Then centuries. And life went on. People forgot what it was like to live in constant fear of infection. They forgot the mass graves, the abandoned villages, the smell of burning bodies. They forgot, the way humans always forget painful things once enough time has passed. But the lessons remained, buried in culture and custom and law. The idea of quarantine. The value of clean water. The importance of isolating the sick. These concepts became so fundamental to Western medicine that we forgot they had to be learned through suffering. That's how most things end, really. Not suddenly, but gradually. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until one day you look around and realize the nightmare is over. You can't point to the exact moment it ended. There's no final battle, no closing scene. It just stops. Sleep well tonight. You're safe. You're here. And that's because countless people before you chose to survive, even when survival seemed impossible. They faced their fears. They buried their dead, they rebuilt their lives. And they passed something precious down to you, the simple, profound knowledge that humans can endure almost anything. The darkness always passes eventually. It just takes time. Sometimes, it takes a very long time. But it passes. And we endure.